Picture this. October 1347. The Sicilian port of Messina. The sun hangs low over the Mediterranean, casting long shadows across the stone docks. Merchants gather, expecting the usual shipment of spices, silks, and grain from the Black Sea. 12 trading galleys appear on the horizon, their sails tattered, moving slowly, too slowly. As they drift into harbor, something feels wrong. The usual shouts and songs of sailors are absent. An eerie silence hangs over the vessels like a burial shroud. When the first mooring rope hits the dock, a dock worker peers into the ship. His face drains of color. Bodies, piled in corners, sprawled across decks, black-skinned and grotesque. The few sailors still alive can barely stand. Their necks bulge with swellings the size of apples, oozing blood and pus. Their skin is mottled with dark hemorrhages, giving them the appearance of rotting corpses while they still breathe. They beg for water in languages thick with delirium. One man stumbles onto the dock and collapses, vomiting black blood onto the stones. Within hours, he's dead. Within days, so are dozens of Messina citizens. Within months, half of Europe will follow them into the grave. What arrived in those 12 ships wasn't cargo. It was death itself, the Black Death, the most catastrophic pandemic in human history. Before diving into the forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The disease that would come to be known as the Black Death didn't originate in Europe. Its roots lay thousands of miles to the east, in the vast steppes of Central Asia, where it had been killing rodents and occasionally humans for centuries. The bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis, though medieval people had no knowledge of bacteria, lived in the guts of fleas that infested rats, marmots, and other rodents across the Silk Road trade routes. For years, the plague smoldered in isolated pockets, contained by geography and the slow pace of medieval travel. But in the 1340s, something changed. Climate patterns shifted. Droughts drove rodent populations into closer contact with human settlements. The Mongol Empire, stretching from China to Eastern Europe, had created unprecedented trade networks, superhighways of commerce that would become highways of death. The plague began its westward march, riding in the fur of rats aboard merchant ships, in the saddlebags of traders, and belongings of travelers who had no idea they were carrying annihilation. In 1346, the Mongol Golden Horde laid siege to Kaffa, a Genoese trading port on the Crimean Peninsula. The siege itself was unremarkable by the brutal standards of medieval warfare, but what happened next would echo through the centuries. As the Mongol warriors besieged the city, the plague erupted in their camp. Soldiers began dying by the hundreds, their bodies piling up faster than they could be buried. According to the Italian notary Gabriele de Musi, who either witnessed the siege or received a detailed first-hand account, the Mongol Khan Janibek made a decision that would doom Europe. Unable to take the city by conventional means, and watching his army dissolve into pestilence, he ordered his men to catapult the plague-ridden corpses over Kaffa's walls. The rotting bodies sailed through the air and crashed into the city's streets, squares, and wells. Whether the corpses themselves could transmit the disease is debated by modern scientists. The plague bacterium typically requires a living vector, but what isn't debated is what happened next. The plague erupted inside Kaffa. People began dying in agony, their bodies erupting in dark swellings, their final hours spent in fever-racked delirium. Panic seized the city. A group of Genoese merchants, watching the death toll climb, made the fateful decision to flee. They loaded their ships with whatever valuable cargo remained and set sail across the Mediterranean, desperate to reach the safety of Italy. They didn't realize that death was their invisible passenger. These ships, perhaps 4, perhaps more, made stops at Constantinople, then Sicily, then Marseilles and Valencia. At each port, they unloaded not just goods but rats, fleas, and doom. The plague leaped from ship to shore with the efficiency of a military invasion. Port cities, with their dense populations and constant traffic, became perfect incubators. From Sicily, the plague spread to mainland Italy. From Marseilles, it spread through France. From Valencia, it spread through Spain. By 1348, the Black Death had reached Paris, London, Bordeaux, Florence, Venice, and Rome. By 1349, it was killing people in Germany, England, Ireland, and Scandinavia. By 1351, it had reached Russia. In just 5 years, the plague transformed Europe into a charnel house, killing an estimated 30 to 50 million people, roughly half the continent's population. But statistics, horrifying as they are, cannot capture what it was like to live through the Black Death. To understand that, we need to step into the shoes of those who watched their world collapse. Imagine you're a merchant in Florence in the spring of 1348. Florence is one of the greatest cities in Europe, a center of banking, art, culture, and learning. Its population exceeds 100,000. The city is wealthy, sophisticated, confident in its place in the world. Then the rumors arrive. Stories from the ports. A terrible disease. Entire ships found drifting, their crews dead. Villages emptied overnight. You dismiss it as exaggeration, the kind of wild tale that always emerges from distant places. But then it arrives. A dockworker in Pisa dies with strange swellings. Then another. Then 10. Then 100. Within weeks, the plague has reached Florence. At first, people respond with the usual remedies. They consult physicians, who prescribe bloodletting and herbal concoctions. They pray in churches, asking God for mercy. They avoid the sick and wash their hands and clothes. But nothing works. The disease spreads with terrifying speed. You begin to notice the symptoms. They always begin the same way. A sudden fever, chills, aching limbs. Then come the buboes, the swellings that give bubonic plague its name. They appear in the groin, armpits, and neck, growing rapidly until they're the size of eggs or even apples. The skin over them turns black and purple, stretched tight over the swollen lymph nodes. The pain is excruciating, so intense that victims scream and thrash. Some buboes burst, releasing torrents of blood and pus that reek of decay. But the buboes are only the beginning. As the infection spreads through the body, dark blotches appear on the skin, hemorrhages beneath the surface that turn the flesh black, giving the disease its name. Victims cough blood. They vomit black bile. Their breath becomes foul, their bodies emanating a stench of putrefaction while they're still alive. Gangrene sets in, turning fingers and toes black and necrotic. The fever climbs higher, driving sufferers into delirium. They rave and scream, their minds broken by the infection ravaging their brains. And then, usually within 3 to 5 days of the first symptoms, they die. Some die faster, especially if the plague takes its pneumonic form, attacking the lungs directly. Others linger for a week or more in unspeakable agony. But the outcome is almost always the same. Death comes swift and certain for nearly everyone infected. At first, the people of Florence try to maintain order. The dead are given proper burials, with priests performing last rites and families mourning. But as the death toll climbs, the systems of civilization break down. There aren't enough graves. There aren't enough priests. There aren't enough hours in the day to bury the dead with dignity. Bodies begin piling up in homes, in streets, in churches. The stench of decay hangs over the city like a fog. Families, realizing that nursing the sick seems to spread the disease, abandon their loved ones. Fathers flee from dying sons. Wives desert husbands. Mothers leave infants to die alone. The sick are left in their homes to suffer and die without comfort or care, their final moments spent in lonely agony. Those who die without family are thrown into mass graves, enormous pits dug outside the city walls where bodies are stacked in layers like firewood, covered with thin layer of earth, then stacked again. The earth itself seems to reject the dead, the ground too full of corpses to hold more. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Italian poet and writer who lived through the plague in Florence, documented what he witnessed with an unflinching eye. He wrote of how the city's social fabric disintegrated. Doctors, the very people charged with healing the sick, refused to see patients, terrified of contracting the disease themselves. Priests, who were supposed to provide spiritual comfort to dying, fled from sick beds rather than administer last rites. Merchants shuttered their shops. Courts closed. Markets emptied. The wealthy fled to countryside estates, hoping that distance from the city would protect them. But the plague followed. It spread to rural villages, where it killed just as efficiently. It infected livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, pigs. Chickens all died in massive numbers, adding agricultural collapse to the human catastrophe. Boccaccio wrote of people dropping dead in the streets as they went about their daily business. Their bodies left where they fell because there was no one willing to move them. He described servants who, knowing their masters were dying, looted their homes and fled with their valuables. He wrote of dogs and cats refusing to approach plague corpses, and of those animals that did investigate dying shortly afterward. The sheer scale of death defied comprehension. In Paris, estimates suggest 50,000 people died, a quarter of the city's population. In Avignon, where the Pope had relocated the papacy, 60,000 died. In Siena, Italy, a chronicler recorded that half the city's 50,000 residents perished, and work on the city's magnificent cathedral, which had been decades in construction, simply stopped. There weren't enough workers or money left to continue. In Venice, one of Europe's richest cities, up to 60% of the population may have died. In some villages and towns, the mortality rate approached 90% or higher, effectively erasing those communities from existence. Entire villages were found empty, with bodies rotting in homes, streets overgrown, livestock wandering untended. The survivors sometimes simply abandoned these places, afraid to remain among so much death. Across Europe, between 30 and 50 million people died between 1347 and 1353. To put that in perspective, Europe's population before the plague was roughly 80 million. The Black Death killed between 37% and 62% of the continent's population in just 6 years. Some regions suffered worse than others. Estimates for England suggest 40 to 60% mortality, for Italy 50 to 60%, for France 40 to 50%. No region was spared. From Iceland to Greece, from Portugal to Russia, the plague reached almost every corner of Europe and killed indiscriminately. But who were these victims? Who were the faces behind the statistics? They were children, dying before they understood what was happening to them. They were mothers, watching helplessly as their babies succumbed to fever. They were craftsmen whose skills died with them, their workshops falling silent. They were monks and nuns in monasteries, dying in such numbers that entire religious orders nearly vanished. They were scholars, artists, merchants, beggars, nobles, and peasants. The plague made no distinction between rich and poor, powerful and weak. Death came for everyone. The randomness of it, the seeming arbitrariness of who lived and who died, was part of what made the Black Death so psychologically devastating. You could follow every precaution, pray constantly, avoid the sick, purify your air with smoke and fragrant herbs, and still die in agony. Or you could nurse dying family members, handle corpses, live in the heart of the outbreak, and inexplicably survive. There was no logic to it. No pattern survivors could discern. Nothing to hold on to that offered hope or explanation. This incomprehensibility drove people to desperate attempts to understand and combat the disease. Medieval medicine, based largely on the teachings of ancient Greek and Roman physicians like Hippocrates and Galen, had no framework for understanding the plague. The dominant medical theory of the time was the doctrine of humors, the belief that health resulted from the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, corresponding to the 4 elements of air, water, fire, and earth. Disease, in this understanding, resulted from an imbalance of humors, which could be corrected through diet, medication, and procedures like bloodletting. Physicians also believed that disease could be caused by bad air, miasma, corrupted by rotting matter, swamp gases, or even astrological events. When the Black Death arrived, physicians applied these theories with confidence, prescribing treatments that, while well-intentioned, ranged from useless to actively harmful. Bloodletting was one of the most common treatments. Physicians believed that draining bad blood would restore humoral balance and allow the body to heal. The procedure involved either applying leeches to the patient's skin, often directly on the buboes, or making incisions with sharp blade to let blood flow into a collection cup. In theory, this would draw out the corrupted humors, causing the disease. In practice, it weakened already sick patients, hastening their deaths. Leeches, which were collected by specialized workers and sold to physicians at high prices, were considered a superior method, But incision was more accessible to the poor. Another technique, called cupping, involved heating a glass cup and placing it upside down on the skin, creating a vacuum that would supposedly draw sickness to the surface. When applied to buboes, the suction would sometimes burst the swellings, releasing the infective fluid, but also causing terrible pain and often spreading infection deeper into the body. Physicians also prescribed a bewildering array of potions, pastes, and fumigants. One of the most expensive and sought-after remedies was theriac, sometimes called Venice treacle. This complex potion, which originated in ancient Rome, could contain up to 80 ingredients, including opium, viper flesh, herbs, spices, and honey, ground together into a thick paste. It was believed to be a universal antidote to poisons and diseases. The very wealthy consumed theriac in the hope it would protect them from or cure the plague. Whether it had any effect is doubtful. The opium would provide pain relief and a euphoric escape from suffering, but it couldn't cure the bacterial infection ravaging the body. For those who couldn't afford theriac, there was Four Thieves vinegar, a concoction of vinegar, wine, or cider mixed with aromatic herbs like sage, rosemary, clove, and wormwood. Legend held that four thieves of Marseilles used this potion to rob the homes of plague victims without becoming infected themselves. Whether the story was true is unknown, but the vinegar became hugely popular. People drank it, bathed in it, and used it to wash their homes and possessions. Some remedies were stranger still. Based on the belief that, like attracts like, physicians recommended placing live animals against the buboes to draw out the disease. The most common method was the Vicary method, named after English physician Thomas Vicary. A live chicken would have the feathers plucked from its rear end, and this bare skin would be pressed against the patient's swollen lymph nodes and strapped in place. The theory was that the healthy chicken would absorb the sickness from the patient. When the chicken showed signs of illness, or died, it would be replaced with a fresh bird. This continued until either the patient recovered or died. There is no evidence it worked, though it must have provided some psychological comfort, a sense that something was being done. Snakes were also used. A snake would be killed, chopped into pieces, and the pieces rubbed over buboes, based on the idea that the serpent associated with Satan and evil would draw the demonic disease out of the body. Pigeons were applied in similar fashion, though why remains unclear. For the very wealthy, even more exotic remedies were available. Drinking crushed emeralds mixed with water or wine was prescribed by some physicians, based on the belief that gemstones held healing properties. For those who couldn't afford emeralds, there was always arsenic or mercury, both of which were believed to purge the body of disease. In reality, these poisons killed patients faster than the plague itself, adding painful heavy metal poisoning to their suffering. The wealthy also sought powdered unicorn horn, ground from what was usually narwhal tusk or rhinoceros horn, which was believed to cure all manner of ailments. The rarity of the substance made it extraordinarily expensive, and while it did nothing to cure plague, its consumption signaled wealth and status. The poor made do with their own desperate remedies, bathing in or drinking urine, which was believed to have purifying properties, making paste from human feces, and applying them to buboes, sitting next to open sewers in the belief that the bad air of the plague would be drawn to the worst air of the sewage. None of these worked. None could work. The people of medieval Europe were fighting an invisible enemy with tools wholly inadequate to the task. Fumigation was another widespread practice. Since bad air was believed to cause disease, people attempted to purify the air around them. Wealthy households burned aromatic herbs and spices, frankincense, myrrh, camphor, sandalwood. The poor burned whatever they had, straw, wood, dung, filling their homes with smoke that they believed would cleanse the atmosphere. People carried posies of flowers or herbs pressed to their noses wherever they went, both to block the stench of death that pervaded plague-struck cities and to filter the air they breathed. The children's rhyme Ring Around the Rosie is often said to reference this practice. A pocket full of posies refers to the herbs, while ashes, we all fall down references both the fumigation fires and the sudden death the plague brought. Whether the rhyme truly dates the Black Death or is a later creation remains debated, but it captures something of the era's grim reality. Another fumigation method involved sitting near intense heat, blazing fireplaces, or even bonfires, with the idea that heavy sweating would expel the disease from the body. This probably led to dangerous dehydration in already feverish patients. And then there were those who believed that the protective power of bad smell could repel bad air, leading people to deliberately expose themselves to foul odors from latrines, tanneries, and slaughterhouses. As the plague raged and medical treatments failed, people turned increasingly to religion for answers. The medieval Christian worldview held that God was the ultimate cause of all events. If medicine couldn't explain or stop the plague, then it must be divine punishment, God's wrath unleashed upon a sinful world. This interpretation was reinforced by clergy who preached that the plague was retribution for human wickedness, greed, lust, pride, blasphemy, heresy. If the plague was God's punishment, the reasoning went, then the only cure was repentance. Churches overflowed with terrified worshippers begging for mercy. Special masses were held, prayers recited in marathon sessions. People purchased religious amulets, relics of saints, blessed medallions, anything that might earn divine protection. They went on pilgrimages to holy sites, hoping that demonstrations of faith would save them. They gave vast sums to the church in the hope of buying God's favor. None of it stopped the dying. In desperation, some turned to more extreme expressions of piety. In 1348, a movement emerged in Austria, possibly originating in Hungary, that would become known as the Flagellants. These were groups of penitents, mostly men, who believed that by inflicting physical suffering upon themselves, they could atone for humanity's sins and persuade God to end the plague. They traveled from town to town in processions, sometimes numbering in the hundreds or even thousands. Upon arriving in a town, they would gather in the public square and begin their ritual. For 33.5 days, the number of years Christ lived, they would flagellate themselves 3 times a day. They stripped to the waist and beat their backs and shoulders with leather scourges studded with sharp metal points. Blood flowed, flesh tore. They sang hymns and chanted prayers as they whipped themselves into states of religious ecstasy or collapse. Townspeople gathered to watch, some joining in, others weeping or praying. For many, the spectacle provided a sense that someone was doing something, that perhaps this extreme demonstration of piety would move God to mercy. For a time, the Flagellants were welcomed and even celebrated. They brought with them a message of hope, that human action, however painful, could influence divine judgment. But their movement soon became problematic. The Flagellants began to claim that their suffering was more effective than the sacraments of the Church, undermining clerical authority. They preached that people didn't need priests or bishops to intercede with God. Their own blood and pain were sufficient. They also began to spread anti-Semitic propaganda, accusing Jews of causing the plague by poisoning wells and rivers. This was a time when anti-Semitism was already endemic in Europe, and the Flagellants' message found eager audiences. In town after town, Jewish communities were attacked. Synagogues were burned. Entire Jewish neighborhoods were razed. Thousands of Jews were tortured and murdered, often burned alive in their homes or in public executions. In some cases, Jews were rounded up and given the choice of conversion or death. Many chose death. Others fled to Eastern Europe, where they faced less immediate persecution, but still lived under the constant threat of violence. The Pope, watching this movement with increasing alarm, eventually condemned the Flagellants. In 1349, Pope Clement VI issued a papal bull denouncing their practices as heretical and ordering their suppression. The movement's challenge to church authority, combined with its role in inciting violence, made it intolerable. Local authorities, with the church's backing, began arresting flagellant leaders and dispersing their processions. The movement fragmented and faded, though some flagellant groups persisted in secret for years. But the damage was done. Thousands of Jews have been killed, and the social fabric of many communities have been torn apart. The scapegoating of Jews during the Black Death was not just a medieval atrocity. It set precedents for centuries of persecution that would follow. Jews were not the only scapegoats. Lepers, already marginalized and feared, were accused of spreading the plague deliberately. Beggars and vagrants were driven from towns. Foreigners and travelers were viewed with suspicion. In some places, people turned on the disabled, the mentally ill, anyone who seemed different or vulnerable. The plague didn't just kill bodies. It killed trust, compassion, the bonds that held communities together. Fear drove people to monstrous acts. Families abandoned their sick. Neighbors turned on each other. The veneer of civilization, already thin in the brutal medieval world, cracked and peeled away, revealing the raw desperation underneath. Yet amid all this horror, there were also acts of courage and compassion. There were priests who stayed with their flocks, administering last rites to the dying even as they knew it would likely cost them their lives. There were physicians who, despite the futility of their treatments, continued to visit the sick, trying everything they knew to ease suffering. There were ordinary people who nursed family members, friends, even strangers at great personal risk. There were nuns and monks who turned their monasteries into hospitals, caring for the afflicted until they too succumbed. These acts of heroism often went unrecorded, overshadowed by the scale of the catastrophe. But they were there, small flames of humanity flickering in the darkness. The one measure that actually worked to slow the plague spread was also the simplest: separation of the sick from the healthy. The concept of quarantine was not entirely new. The Bible contains instructions for isolating lepers, but the Black Death prompted its systematic application on a civic scale. The first city to implement effective quarantine measures was Ragusa, a port city on the Adriatic coast, modern-day Dubrovnik, Croatia. Ragusa's population had been devastated when the plague first struck in 1348. City officials, observing that the disease seemed to spread through contact with infected people and goods, decided on a radical policy. Beginning in 1377, any ship arriving at Ragusa's port was required to anchor in a designated area and wait 30 days before its crew or cargo could come ashore. During this period, called Trentino 30 days, officials would observe whether anyone aboard showed signs of illness. If they did, the ship was turned away, or the sick removed and isolated. If no one fell ill, the ship was permitted to dock and unload. This waiting period was later extended to 40 days, quarantino in Italian, from which we get the English word quarantine, based on the biblical precedent of 40 days' significance. The policy worked. Ragusa's death toll in subsequent plague outbreaks was significantly lower than in cities without quarantine measures. Other cities took notice. Venice, Milan, Genoa, and Marseille adopted similar systems, creating quarantine stations where travelers and goods could be held and monitored. Milan went further, implementing draconian enforcement. When plague was detected in a household, officials sealed the entire building, locking the healthy and sick inside together until all either recovered or died. This brutal policy was horrifyingly effective. Milan's mortality rate during the Black Death was among the lowest of any major European city, possibly as low as 15%. In 1350, Milan also constructed the first known lazaretto or pest house, a building outside the city walls specifically dedicated to housing plague victims. Here, the sick could be isolated and cared for by physicians and caregivers who volunteered or were compelled to staff these facilities. These pest houses became features of plague management for centuries. They were grim places. Mortality rates among those admitted were extraordinarily high, often 70% or more. But they served the crucial function of removing infected individuals from the general population, slowing transmission. The caregivers in these pest houses were often condemned criminals offered freedom in exchange for their service, or the desperately poor who took the work because it paid well, though they rarely lived long enough to spend their wages. Some cities hired plague doctors, physicians who specialize in treating plague patients. These doctors are famous for their distinctive costume: a long wax coat, gloves, boots, a wide brim hat, and most iconically, a beak mask. The beak was stuffed with aromatic herbs, spices, and sponges soaked in vinegar, intended to filter the miasmatic air before the doctor breathed it. The doctors also carried a long cane, which they used to examine patients without touching them and to move bodies and clothing. The full costume created an eerie, bird-like figure that must have been terrifying to encounter in a plague-ridden city. Whether the costume provided any real protection is questionable. It probably prevented some transmission via respiratory droplets and kept fleas at a distance, but it symbolized the attempt to fight death with whatever tools were available. Despite these efforts, the Black Death could not be stopped, only slowed. The plague raged across Europe for 6 years, from 1347 to 1353, killing in waves. It would arrive in a city or region, spike to a terrifying crescendo, then fade as it ran out of victims. But it didn't disappear. The plague became endemic in Europe, returning in cyclical outbreaks for the next 4 centuries. The Second Pandemic, as historians call this period, saw major plague outbreaks roughly every decade. In 1361 to 1362, 1369, 1374 to 1375, 1400, 1438 to 1439, and on. These later outbreaks never matched the initial mortality of the Black Death, but each killed tens or hundreds of thousands. The plague of 1361, called the Children's Plague, disproportionately killed young people who had no immunity from earlier exposure. The Great Plague of London in 1665 to 1666 killed perhaps 100,000 people. The plague remained a constant, terrifying presence in European life until the 18th century, when it finally retreated, though cases continued to occur sporadically into the 19th and even 20th centuries. What were the long-term effects of the Black Death on European society? They were profound and far-reaching, touching every aspect of life. First, the sheer demographic catastrophe reshaped the continent. With half the population dead, labor became suddenly and acutely scarce. Before the plague, Europe was overpopulated relative to its agricultural capacity. Peasants were numerous and cheap, bound to the land they worked by the feudal system. Lords could demand heavy rents and labor obligations because peasants had no alternatives. But after the plague, the labor shortage gave surviving peasants leverage. They demanded higher wages, better conditions, the right to move and seek employment elsewhere. When lords resisted, peasants revolted. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England, the Jacquerie in France, and similar uprisings across Europe were direct consequences of the post-plague economic transformation. Though these revolts were suppressed, often brutally, the feudal system never recovered. Serfdom gradually declined across Western Europe, replaced by wage labor and tenant farming. The Black Death, in this sense, was a force for social change, breaking down centuries-old structures of power and dependency. Economic effects rippled outward. With fewer workers, production declined, but so did demand because there were fewer consumers. Prices for agricultural goods fell, hurting large landowners who relied on selling grain. But prices for manufactured goods and skilled labor rose, benefiting artisans and craftsmen. The wool trade, one of Europe's most important industries, collapsed because so many sheep died during the plague, creating shortages that lasted for years. Some regions and industries thrived in the post-plague world. Northern Italian city-states, with their adaptable economies, recovered quickly and entered a period of prosperity that fueled the Renaissance. Other regions, particularly in Eastern Europe, saw lords tighten rather than loosen controls, leading to a second serfdom that persisted into the 19th century. Cultural and psychological impacts were equally significant. The constant presence of death in daily life altered how people thought about mortality, the afterlife, and the meaning of existence. Art and literature became obsessed with death. The dance of death, or danse macabre, became a popular artistic motif. Images and stories depicting death as a skeletal figure leading people from all walks of life. Popes, kings, merchants, peasants, in a dance of grave, emphasizing that death comes for everyone and all earthly power and wealth are meaningless. Memento mori, remember you must die, became a cultural watchword. Skulls, skeletons, and decaying corpses appeared in paintings, sculptures, and manuscripts as reminders of life's transience. This was not morbid nihilism, but rather a profound shift in worldview, a recognition of human vulnerability that the Black Death had made impossible to ignore. The plague also eroded faith in established institutions. The Church, which claimed spiritual authority and divine favor, had been unable to stop the plague or even adequately explain it. Priests died in huge numbers, some because they bravely ministered to the sick, others because they lived in close communal quarters in monasteries where disease spread easily. The clergy who survived were often poorly educated replacements, rushed through training to fill vacant positions, leading to a decline in the Church's intellectual and moral authority. People began to question church teachings, to seek more direct, personal relationships with God, to explore mysticism and heresy. This questioning would eventually feed into the Protestant Reformation of the 16th century. Similarly, the failure of physicians to cure the plague damaged the credibility of medical authority, though it also spurred some physicians to question ancient doctrines and seek new knowledge, a shift that would contribute to the scientific revolution. On a deeply personal level, survivors of the Black Death live with trauma that shaped their outlook and behavior. Some turn to hedonism, embracing the philosophy of eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Boccaccio's Decameron, with its tales of love, lust, humor, and human folly, reflects this attitude. Life is short and uncertain, so seize pleasure where you can. Others turned inward, becoming more religious, more charitable, more focused on preparing for the afterlife. Still others became cynical, bitter, hardened by the losses they'd endured. Imagine surviving the plague, watching your family die, your community collapse, everything you knew destroyed, and then trying to rebuild. How do you trust again? How do you hope? For many survivors, the world was forever darker, forever haunted by the memory of what they'd witnessed. Yet humanity is resilient. Slowly, painstakingly, Europe recovered. Population growth resumed, though it took more than a century for numbers to return to pre-plague levels. Cities were rebuilt. Fields were replanted. New generations were born who knew the plague only as stories told by their elders. But the Black Death left an indelible mark on the European consciousness. It ended the Middle Ages in a very real sense, shattering the certainties and structures of medieval society. What emerged in its wake was a world more questioning, more dynamic, more modern. The Renaissance, the age of exploration, the scientific revolution, all were, in some ways, children of the Black Death, born from the ruins of the old world. And what of the plague itself? Modern science, armed with tools medieval people could never imagine, has unlocked its secrets. In 1894, during a plague outbreak in Hong Kong, French bacteriologist Alexander Yersin identified the bacterium responsible for the disease, which was named Yersinia pestis in his honor. We now know that plague is primarily a disease of rodents, passed to humans when fleas that are fed on infected animals bite people. The bacterium blocks the flea's digestive system, causing it to regurgitate infected blood into the bite wound. Once inside a human host, Yersinia pestis travels to the lymph nodes, where it reproduces rapidly, causing the characteristic buboes. From there, it can spread to the bloodstream, causing septicemic plague, or to the lungs, causing pneumonic plague, which can then spread person to person through respiratory droplets. We know that the medieval Black Death was primarily bubonic plague spread by fleas, with secondary outbreaks of pneumonic plague that spread through human contact in crowded conditions. Modern antibiotics can easily cure plague if caught early, reducing mortality rates to below 10%. But untreated plague still kills at medieval rates. 50 to 60% for bubonic, 90 to 95% for pneumonic. And the plague has never gone away. It still exists in rodent populations in Central Asia, Africa, and the Americas, including the southwestern United States. Every year, a few thousand people worldwide contract plague, and while most survive with treatment, some still die. The potential for a major outbreak remains, especially in regions with poor healthcare infrastructure, and in our interconnected, globalized world, where diseases can travel from one continent to another in hours aboard airplanes. The lessons of the Black Death remain relevant. We like to think we've conquered infectious disease, that pandemics are problems of the past. But the Black Death reminds us that invisible killers can emerge suddenly, spread with terrifying speed, overwhelm our defenses, and kill on unimaginable scales. The COVID-19 pandemic, though far less deadly than the Black Death, offered a glimpse of what mass disease events feel like. The fear, the disruption, the economic damage, the social strain, the political conflicts over how to respond. It reminded us that we are still vulnerable, that our knowledge and technology, while vastly greater than that of medieval Europeans, cannot entirely protect us. We have antibiotics, vaccines, advanced medical infrastructure, but we also have far larger, denser populations, faster global travel, and pathogens that can mutate and evolve. The Black Death killed perhaps 200 million people worldwide, not just in Europe, but also in Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. A similar pathogen, spreading in the modern world, could potentially kill billions before being contained, despite our advantages. This is not to induce panic, but to acknowledge reality. Infectious disease remains one of the greatest threats to human civilization, and we ignore that threat at our peril. But if the Black Death teaches us anything beyond the dangers of disease, it's also the capacity of human beings to endure to survive, to rebuild. The people of the 14th century faced something that must have seemed like the literal end of the world. Half the people they knew died. Their institutions failed. Their explanation for reality proved inadequate. And yet they carried on. They buried their dead, tended their crops, raised children, created art, pursued knowledge. They didn't let the catastrophe define them, or at least not entirely. They adapted, they changed, they moved forward. The world that emerged from the Black Death was in many ways better than the one that preceded it. More free, more innovative, more humane in some respects. This doesn't justify or redeem the suffering, but it does suggest that even from the worst disasters, renewal is possible. Today, the Black Death exists in museums and history books, in the mass graves archaeologists occasionally uncover, in the genetic signatures researchers find in ancient DNA extracted from plague pits. It exists in the changed landscape of Europe, where villages abandoned during the plague remain visible as faint outlines in fields, where churches built in thanksgiving for survival still stand. It exists in our language, quarantine, plague, pandemic, and in our cultural memory of what mass death looks like. It exists as both a warning and a testament. A warning of what can happen when disease meets vulnerability, and a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable horror. The Black Death was not a punishment from God, despite what medieval people believed. It was not a cosmic judgment or a moral lesson. It was a bacterium, a microscopic organism acting according to the laws of biology, reproducing and spreading with no malice or meaning. But the human response to it, the fear and courage, the cruelty and compassion, the failures and adaptations, that was full of meaning. It showed what we are capable of, both the worst and the best. It showed how fragile our civilizations are, how quickly order can collapse into chaos. But it also showed that we can rebuild, that we can learn, that we can continue. The Black Death killed half of Europe, but Europe survived. Humanity survived. And in surviving, we became something different, something in some ways better. The medieval world died with those 50 million people, but the modern world was born from their ashes. That's the legacy of the Black Death. Not just the deaths, not just the suffering, but also the transformation, the renewal, the stubborn insistence on life in the face of death. It's a legacy that remains relevant today as we face our own challenges, our own pandemics, our own moments of crisis. The plague reminds us that we are vulnerable, but also that we are resilient, that we can fail, but also that we can adapt, that we will face disasters, but that we can survive them, and that even in the darkest times, when death seems to have won, life finds a way to continue. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's darkest chapters. If this story moved you or taught you something new, please share this video with someone who values the hidden truths of history. Don't forget to check out our next deep dive into the fascinating and often brutal realities of the past. The past isn't just behind us. It's the ground we're standing on, shaping who we are and who we'll become. Until next time, remember that history doesn't just teach us where we've been. It shows us what we're capable of, for better and for worse. And in that knowledge lies both warning and hope.